Hi guys, today we're going to take a look at the Aeroforce gauge. Get a lot of questions. What is it? What does it do? Is it worth buying? This gauge is going to be set up, so we're going to plug it in to the data link connector, and that's the entire setup, is you just plug it in and it's going to boot up. Now you will notice when this gauge boots up that it's going to show the setup menu, and that's because there is no parameters programmed into it yet. So this is our setup menu. Now the left button scrolls, the right button selects. So we want air intake temperature. So I'm going to hit the right button to select it. We don't want ambient. We do want coolant. We don't need the cats. I'm going to show you basically what I use for tuning. We don't really need math. Let's select miles per hour because we might want to calibrate our speedometer. We don't really need any of this. I do recommend that you look at your long-term fuel trims. That is one of the most important parameters in the vehicle because that's basically the end result of all the feedback from the sensors, and you want to see those plus or minus about 10%. We're going to go down to, and you can set this up, by the way, for miles per gallon. It does have a very accurate tripometer, but you do have to set it up, meaning you have to set in the cubic inches and the math flow and all this stuff. But if you spend the time and you do it right, you can get that miles per gallon down to the 10th of a mile per gallon. I found much more accurate than the digital instrument cluster. Aeroforce does not include a manual with the gauge. It's a rather large manual, so you have to go to their website and download it. I don't really find horsepower that important. The barometer I do not believe is built into this unit. I think that has to be imported. I want to know battery voltage, and this is control module voltage, so that's going to be less than system voltage. So if your battery's running at 14.5, this might show 14.0 or so take that into account. We don't need the commanded equivalent ratio. Air-fuel ratio, you can look at it. That'll basically tell you if you're in PE or not. MAF frequency can help if you're having airflow problems, but we're not going to select that right now. Of course, we want transmission temperature. Knock retard can help if you're running cheap gas or you're having some issues with detonation. O2 sensor millivolts can be very telling. This is basically the feedback from the oxygen sensors. Now this is B1, S1. That's bank 1, sensor 1. You want to look at bank 1, sensor 1, and bank 2, sensor 1. That's the main feedback to the computer. The downstreams basically monitor your catalytic converters, so we don't need to look at that right now. And this would be your bank 1, sensor 2, and your bank 2, sensor 2. Air-fuel commanded, like we said, that can be useful to tell if you're in open loop or closed loop. And there's several open loop modes, like cold start, deceleration fuel cutoff, performance enrichment, etc. These do have virtual sensors, so if you put ethanol in the tank, it can tell you how much alcohol is in the tank. Oil pressure, yeah, I think we want that. And by the way, oil temperature for the engine is a calculated value, so we're not really going to get an accurate number there, so I'm not going to select it. Current gear, a lot of you guys might want, and I'm going to show you some cool stuff with that. We don't really need torque converter slip and all that. These analog inputs, if you wanted to, let's say, import fuel pressure off the rail, any 0 to 5 volt sensor, basically this gauge will display. So if you have a wideband O2 sensor and you want to see actual air fuel ratio, or you want to import fuel pressure, you can do that here. And then exit's going to exit. Now there's two ways you can do this. You can select exit and then push the right button, or you can push both buttons simultaneously, which is what I'm going to do. The gauge is going to boot back up. Now you'll notice that it says SS. I've programmed that logo in. Annunciator is not set up, and I'm going to explain to you what that is. The annunciator is those two red lights you saw at the top. So you can program pretty much any parameter, like let's say charging system. If the charging system goes below 12 volts, you can have one of those lights light up and warn you that the charging system is failing. If your oil pressure drops below a certain pressure, you can have the annunciator show that. Also, there's something called the cyclic scan, and we're going to look at that. And the cyclic scan basically means you only have two parameters here that are showing, in this case, coolant temp and battery voltage. But if you wanted to see more values, you can go into the cyclic scan and it'll show up to 4 pages of data, 2 at a time, so that's 8 PIDs. However, I don't really like that, because if I'm looking at coolant temp and I want to see what that coolant temp is and that disappears, that's just not a good thing in my opinion, so I don't set up the cyclic scan. So if we're in this scan mode and we hit the left button, it's going to scroll the data on the top parameter for what we just programmed in. So we have miles per hour, long-term fuel trim bank 2, battery voltage, trans temp, oil pressure, etc. Now current gear is going to be interesting, and I'm going to show you that in a second, so let's leave that there. If you want to scroll the bottom parameter, you use the right button. And you can see we got trans temp, oil pressure, all this stuff. Let's go to coolant temp, because I find this is probably the best setup. Current gear on the top, coolant in the bottom. So as you can see, this gauge basically acts as an enhanced scanner. It's not a generic scanner like some of these Bluetooth adapters or a cheap scanner you get at AutoZone. This is a GM enhanced, and they do make a Jeep enhanced with bi-directional controls. So let's look at some of the other features. Now, if you hit both buttons at the same time, it's going to put us into the setup menu. Scan is just where we were. As you can see, I selected the right button and it put us right back into the scan mode. So both buttons at the same time. Here's setup, and if we go to setup, here's all your parameters again. We're going to scroll all the way around, and this time let's hit exit. So we got to wait for it to boot up again. So when it boots up, it's going to go into the scan mode if you have parameters selected. And we have wired our data link connector so that this gauge will boot up and boot down as you turn the key on and off, which means you don't have to worry about booting it up by itself. So let's go back into the menu, both buttons at the same time. Here's a cyclic scan we talked about. And again, I don't really think you need this. This is to go into the cyclic scan mode where it'll go from page to page with parameters. This is a setup for the cyclic scan, how long it shows each page. You can record and play back data. So if you want to do a 0 to 60 run and you want to look at your air-fuel ratio, whatever, that's what that function is for. Misfires are pretty obvious. Now this is a really important one, get DTC. Get digital trouble code. So if I were to select the right button, you can see this vehicle has no faults. But get DTC and clear DTC is going to be a very useful function for you, because if you're going down the road and your check engine light comes on, you want to know what that code is. You can actually do it on the fly, and you can even clear the codes on the fly. If you had a reduced power code, let's say, pop up, you can clear it with the Aeroforce gauge and never get off the highway. No reason to stop, get off the highway and disconnect your battery or go to AutoZone. Just simply scan it right here. So we're going to go down 3 pages, 1, 2, 3, and there's our get DTC. There's our clear DTC, which we don't have to do because we don't have any codes in this vehicle. Invert is to invert the screen, as you can see, and that's kind of your preference. I like this, so we're going to keep it there. Now, dimmer can be useful because you have basically 3 different levels of brightness. This is the middle, this is the brightest, this is the dimmest. This would obviously be for nighttime, and I leave it in the middle most of the time because that's what I like. Let's go back 3 and 4 pages. Don't worry about data rate, performance. This gauge can do 0 to 60 and give you statistics, as we talked about. Annunciator is to set up those lights up top, up here. So if you have a parameter go out of a certain range, it'll warn you with that light. Here's where you turn the annunciator on and off. You don't really got to worry about horsepower stuff or altitude. I don't believe this thing has a barometer in it. I could be wrong, but I've never actually seen data on that. Now, miles per gallon can be really interesting because, like I said, if you set this up properly, and you do have to go through a setup and read the manual, it can be extremely accurate, much more accurate than the one on your dash. And then the analog are the inputs that we talked about. So here's the logo, and we'll just go into it really quick. You got Cadillac, Camaro, SS. We chose the SS because I think that's the coolest one. So let's scroll all the way back down to the bottom. We're going to go to controls, which is an important thing. Okay, this last menu, controls, is bi-directional controls. So if you have the correct fan, you can drive it. You can reset your fuel trims. Case learn is probably going to be the most used function. When you set up an ECM for GM, you have to do what's called a crankshaft variation learn. A lot of you guys get a PL315. PL315, crankshaft variation not learned, does not mean you have a bad crank sensor. Don't replace your crank sensor. There's a one-time setup. At least it's usually one time. If you leave the computer disconnected from a battery for months, you might have to do it again. And there's some rare cases where it'll request it. But usually it's a one-time setup. And basically what's happening is the computer is learning the crankshaft variation. And what that means is it's taking a picture of the crankshaft variation. And then if you do have a misfire, it compares that misfire pattern to the stored crankshaft variation pattern. And if it goes outside a certain percentage, it's going to throw a misfire code. So it's basically misfire detection for OBD2. But you have to learn it. If you don't learn it, that light's going to stay on and you're going to have this P0315. So this gauge will do that. In fact, even though this vehicle doesn't need it, let's go ahead and do a crankshaft variation learn. So I'm going to select it with the right button. Vehicle must be in park, blah, blah, blah. We're going to do that. Hit any key, a park. Okay, so we're going to keep going. Now it's going to say rev engine to 4 or 5,000. When I rev it up right now, you're going to feel it cut off. As soon as it cut off, I let off. Now it's taking its picture. Turn ignition off for 30 seconds. I'm not going to do that because, like I said, this one already learned. But controls are very important because that way you don't have to go out and have somebody do this for you. These other controls for the intercooler pump, you don't really got to be too concerned about. So we want to go back into the scan mode. So we're going to hit exit. Remember, right button, hit scan, and here we are back in our scan mode. So that's a pretty quick look at the Aeroforce gauge. A lot of you guys ask me what it is. It's a convenient enhanced scan gauge that mounts on your JK permanently, and it gives you a little bit more data than the generic gauges that are out there. As you saw, it can read and clear codes, which can be very useful if you're out in the trail or out in the middle of nowhere. Actually, I don't care what powertrain you have. It could be Jeep, it could be Chrysler, it could be GM. Just have something with you to scan your vehicle. Now I'm going to show you really quick here one of the things that I use. This is Torque, and this is the Bluetooth adapter I use. These cost about $10 or less on eBay or Amazon, and you can see all the data that you get. And we're going to do a separate video on Torque, but if you don't want to spend the money for the Aeroforce gauge, go ahead and get yourself a Bluetooth adapter like this, because you got to have something. You don't want to be driving around with nothing. And this vehicle does have our pedestal mount. As you can see, that is included with the gauge when you buy it from us. If you want to do a dual gauge, you're going to get an A-pillar mount. I don't really see a need for the dual gauge other than if you want to run a Jeep and a GM Aeroforce gauge, because Aeroforce does have an enhanced Jeep gauge that does bi-directional stuff also. I like the gauge right here because you're looking at the dash and it's right there in front of you. You're not having to look down here. You're not having to look up there. It's right there in front of you where it needs to be. It's really not blocking anything important other than the sway bar light. And if you don't have a Rubicon, like this vehicle is not a Rubicon, then it doesn't really matter. And even if you do have a Rubicon, all you gotta do is look around the side and you can see the sway bar light. So I think that's the ideal spot for it. I just fired this vehicle up. This is an older Aeroforce gauge install. I forgot to show you something on the other vehicle. And you can see we just fired this vehicle up. Our fuel trims aren't online yet. You see our battery, trans temp. Here you can see the O2 is running fat up. It just started to switch. It's starting to switch slowly because this has got ultra fast O2s that start switching about 20 seconds after you start it. So let's go back to current gear. That's what I wanted to show you. And you can see the 14.69 means that we are in closed loop now. All right, so if we look at this parameter here, current gear, you see it says first gear. That's because this parameter is going to show what the current forward gear status is. Now, if I pull this back into the tap shift gate, you will see that the dash is showing first and the Aeroforce is showing first. However, these are two different parameters. The dash is showing the gear selected by the driver. The Aeroforce gauge is showing the current gear that you're in. So if I were to bump the shifter to the right, you're going to see that that parameter on the dash is going to move. And I can bring this all the way up and down through the gears. But you'll notice that the Aeroforce gauge is staying on first gear. What's happening here is I am selecting the maximum gear. So if I leave this in third gear and I take off, it's going to shift 1, 2, 3, and then stop. And the current gear display on the Aeroforce gauge is then going to match. It's going to show us going through the gears, 1, 2, 3, and then when we hit 3, it's going to stop. So what's displayed on the dash is the gear that you're selecting you want to be in. What's being displayed on the Aeroforce gauge is the gear that you are in. At any time, you can always throw one of our conversions into drive and you're a full automatic. We're going to follow this video up with some more electronics. We're going to look at EFI Live, HP tuners, which are basically tuning software. We're going to look at scanners like the Bluetooth adapters and real scanners that mechanics use, because really a lot of this goes hand in hand with a swap, and I deal with this every day. Guys asking me, what does an Aeroforce gauge do? I want to buy that versus something else. In some of my earlier videos, you guys saw the dash deck, and that was an awesome scan gauge during its day, but I don't think it's in production anymore. I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. Now you will notice that when I shut this vehicle down, the Aeroforce gauge is going to shut down with the vehicle. As the network goes to sleep, so will the Aeroforce gauge. So here's my old dash deck unit. I don't think they're making this available anymore. So we'll be back with a tutorial on HP tuners soon. Thank you.